you see a lot of this coming to fruition in Web3, where you basically have the spontaneous organization of communities around blockchains, around memes, around artworks, in a way that people have a vested interest in these technologies or these tokens, to the extent that their success could even lead to life-changing results. Hey, David.
Hello. How are you?
Great. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad.
You look good. You sound good. No problems.
I'm working on it, man.
Yeah.
I'm working on it. So how are you going? It's Saturday evening in Toronto?
It is. Yeah, 6 p.m.
Very nice. Very nice. So do you usually work on the weekends, or what is your schedule like?
I'm kind of working all the time. It's kind of hard to get out of work mode, I find.
Yeah.
There's always something to do, and I feel like if I'm not pushing forward on things over the weekend, I just don't have time to get to things during the week that aren't absolutely essential. And then, important things that I like to do or want to work on, just don't get moved forward if I don't work on them on a Saturday or Sunday. So yeah, I'm always doing things like that. And I've got my hands in a few different cookie jars at the moment. So just balancing them all.
Yeah, that's kind of I think the modern way, and even possibly the healthy way of working, is, bucketing your work into, your 8 hours a day. Maybe that's great for some folks, but if you integrate your love and your passion and the things that you're really interested in as your work, then there's no leaving it. It's just what you're contemplating, what you're thinking about, and what you're doing all the time, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I really got into that kind of modality during my PhD, when it sort of became impossible to distinguish between when I was working on it versus when I wasn't.
Yeah.
Like a dissertation, you don't really plug in and plug out. It's something that's always on your mind. You're always thinking about what the topic is. You're always, even if you're not doing explicit research on it, experiences you have in life or other things you encounter may inform your opinion on how it's coming along. So that was 6 years of just being in that kind of a mode. And I don't think I've ever really left it. And I think you're right, David, that it's a sign that actually things are going well in life, and that someone is applied to things that they truly care about and that just enmesh with their interests, where that clear distinction between work and leisure starts to fade a little bit.
Yeah, you get integrated, I think they say. You're now integrated.
Yeah.
So tell us about your journey, mate. So you did a PhD, and what led you up to that? Did you have a background in arts? Do you come from an artistic family, or what was that journey like that found you spending 6 years on a dissertation?
Yeah, great question. In some ways, I sort of just fell into it. And you could say it came about just through following my passions. I took a film studies specialization in my undergraduate. I graduated in 2008, so the year of the financial collapse. And so I sort of felt like staying in the university for another couple of years and getting a master's degree might be a great opportunity while things shake out on the economic front.
Yeah.
And so I did that, really started to apply myself even more and get deeper into it and discover a love for philosophy, for theory, for art cinemas from around the world. And I really took a lot of time during those couple of years to just screen as many films as I could. I would go to the film library, I would go to the public library in London, Ontario, and I would be just pulling out everything they had from their world cinema section, and really fell in love with Iranian cinema, Taiwanese cinema, Thai cinema, cinemas that just wouldn't really otherwise be encountered if not for making a bit of a deliberate effort to search them out and enter into the great auteurs of these various national cinemas. So that's what I started to do. And then my passion and my love for the seventh art, as it's called, just kept deepening. And so I thought it would be a perfect opportunity to then parlay that passion into a PhD. So I moved to Montreal in 2011 and embarked on what ended up becoming a 6-year journey doing a PhD at Concordia University in Montreal, which was really incredible on so many levels. I was really immersed in the philosophy scene of the city, going to reading groups all of the time, participating in happenings and intellectual events, going to guest lectures and talks, giving many myself, expanding my own research repertoire, just going to the park, reading, reading book after book, devouring
That's the
books.
life, man. That sounds great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great. Exactly.
I mean, that's where I want to get back to,
Yeah.
that's the dream. So please.
Yeah, in some ways it is. I'll tell you like a little anecdote from then too. Like I would regularly go to the Cinémathèque Québécoise. So it's the National Cinémathèque, the national cinema of Quebec, and it's in the heart of Montreal, right by Barrie-UQAM station. And I would go there during the days and just watch sometimes like 3 films in one day. And I had a membership pass where you could pay, I think at the time it was like $10 a month, I think. So it was like $120 a year, and Amazing. You could see unlimited films. It was like an admission to every single film they showed that year. So I would go and I'd just see so many films there. I encountered a lot of filmmakers there. I met Amos Gatai there. I met Jürgen Lett there from Denmark. So I met a lot of really important filmmakers there. And the thing I was going to say about it, the anecdote, was that I'd be going there and, it would be me and people who were all retirees because, they had the time to spend the day in the cinema. So it's true. It kind of is a life. I was living the retired life at 24, 25.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool, man. So jump forward a bit. You did your thesis. You were predominantly focused on film studies, and you've gone from there on a journey since that's brought you into the traditional art world, but also the digital art world. So maybe how did that progression occur? Where did you go from film to sort of traditional arts, and then to digital?
Yeah, great question. Well, when I was doing my PhD, I was really surrounded by people who had a fascination, as I did with cinema, but with various other art forms. And a lot of people in the lab, which was put together by my supervisor, were actually studying in different fields. So there were dancers, there were various movement practitioners of various types. There were performance artists, people with an interest in theater. There were novelists, et cetera, et cetera. So I was really immersed in people who were in a milieu that wasn't just cinema focused as much as I was based in a cinema department. So that was a really enriching experience. And, I'd be going to events with a lot of these colleagues and collaborators around the city. And in terms of how that ended up transitioning into an interest in Web3 and eventually in digital art as well, was, interestingly enough, actually around 2017. So the year of the real big crypto bull run that I completely missed out on because I wasn't involved in it at the time. But that was the moment that I first started hearing about it, and people in my milieu started to talk about Bitcoin and crypto. So that was the time it first came into my consciousness. Prior to that, I don't think I'd even really heard of it. Maybe I'd seen like a brief article or something, never considered it to be something that would be important to me, or that I would end up working in that field, or that even really had much relevance to my life. It seemed a little bit like a novelty.
Financial. It was mostly sort of financial tech focused at that point as well, right? The implications for broader creative industries weren't really being explored to any great depth, or at least not in a very public way.
Exactly. Like, keep in mind, in 2017, if I remember correctly, you had Bitcoin, then you had Ethereum, which was this like smart contract alternative to Bitcoin, but there weren't really many apps. There weren't really like things to do on the smart contract, right? Like, people, I guess there were a few. I think maybe MakerDAO went back to around then, and there was clearly some things on there, but like there weren't like consumer friendly apps, and there weren't like the ecosystem that we know today and over the last few years definitely didn't exist then, right? So it was kind of like there were more currencies, right? It was kind of like the era of cryptocurrency. So I ended up kind of hearing about these, heard about some friends starting to make some money on this. Didn't really know how to get involved. I had been like just involved in really rudimentary investments. and had no sense of how to ever acquire something like that or participate in that kind of an ecosystem. But then people in my milieu started to speak about it. We also had a visit to our lab from a Web3 project, actually, called Onchain, which is actually still to this day a top 200 crypto, and a project that I follow and I'm supportive of. I think they have they've done a lot of things the right way, and that's kind of another conversation. But anyways, they came and were kind of taking Web3 very seriously from a social and political perspective, and that's when I started to really cue in that, oh, this is actually the decentralization that so many critical theorists that who I've been reading about throughout my education and who were writing in the 1960s, the 70s, the 80s, and 90s. This is what, in some ways, they had been calling for, is like a greater decentralization of society, challenging centralized power, challenging the ideology that comes with centralization, et cetera, et cetera. So then the light bulb moment started to go off when I thought, okay, this has some kind of political valence. And then, that spurred deeper intellectual interest in it. That also just spurred, greater investment in the ecosystem on numerous levels.
Many a rabbit hole opens up when you see that tech infrastructure essentially being the manifestation of what those political philosophers were trying to sort of say, this is a better way, but we didn't really have the tools. Now we're sort of trying to build out that tooling with this Web3 infrastructure.
Exactly. And David, I'll tell you, for those listeners of yours who have an interest in 20th century philosophy, so the main figurehead around which my thesis was constructed, my doctoral thesis, is an individual named Felix Guattari. And he was a major collaborator of someone named Gilles Deleuze, who is one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. And the reason I mention that is that Deleuze's calling card, so to speak, or one of the recurring motifs in his work, especially in his early work, but it really runs throughout, was an advocacy for what he called non-statist thinking or non-state philosophy. And so he was very much, he was very, not even opposed, just like not interested in the kind of philosophy that stemmed from Hegel and that stemmed from other state-oriented philosophers. And I mention that just to say that there has been always in the work that I did throughout my doctoral research and just throughout my academic training overall, a wariness of and a criticality towards the state. And so when I started to realize that, oh, wait, it could become possible to transact without the permission of the state, or that there can be assets that may appreciate in value without bypassing, exactly, while bypassing the state or not being completely subject to the whims of the state. So that became a political interest as well.
Was that, and I don't know that thinker's work very well, but would that be considered a libertarian sort of mindset? Or, and this is something that's really interesting to me about Web3, is that you've got this sort of libertarian, edge to a lot of the sort of the thinking and the impetus around a lot of these projects and a lot of the sort of the raison d'etre for these projects. But there's also this really powerful communal side to this as well. I mean, just that these are community driven, right? And that's about moving power to the edges so that the community is actually, which in some ways in a traditional political philosophy is we're on opposite sides of the spectrum there, but we're actually integrating, aren't we? A lot of those sort of ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of how to situate these philosophers, they wouldn't be described as libertarian because that tends to come along with certain economic assumptions around the social utility of capital markets. And I think, actually, I'm certain, these philosophers were quite critical of capitalism, at least as it had developed in their era, and even as they predicted it would develop. And so it wouldn't be accurate to call them libertarian because they didn't have faith in the market to rectify the social problems of their day. But that said, libertarian more in the anarchist sense, that they were simply critical
in a
of the
purely
state,
political sense rather than economic.
More in the political sense, exactly right. That's a good way to put it. And then also that they had a certain belief in the potential of collectivities to spontaneously organize in ways that they termed, could be revolutionary, or that sometimes in my work I say could be therapeutic, or in some ways, more generally, you could just say is transformative. So putting a belief in the power of the collective to organize in ways that may not be sanctioned from on high, may not be sanctioned by the state.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of one of the through lines of their thought and kind of the ethos that was there. And then, of course, you see a lot of this coming to fruition in Web3, where you basically have the spontaneous organization of communities around blockchains, around memes, around artworks, and in a way that people have a vested interest in these technologies or these tokens, to the extent that their success could even lead to life-changing results for the people who are part of the community. So, in some ways, there's a lot of parallels there.
Yeah, interesting. It's, I follow a number of different projects, and one of the things that I've been fascinated about is, so I did an undergrad in political science, right? And I spent a lot of time studying international relations and environmental policy and a lot of these sort of areas. And I became very disillusioned with how dysfunctional these institutions are, right? How slow moving they are, and how just ossified these institutions are. And that's sort of one of the main reasons that I stopped pursuing that as a consideration for a career, right? Is I just didn't see any capacity for me to really make any impact, right? And what I see in some of the Web3 communities is the flip side of that, which is, there's a flurry of activity, but it's chaos. It's messy, right? And what I think is interesting is how these bottom-up organizations, these bottom-up communities rather, are trying to apply structure, but then the reaction against too much structure, that dialogue is fascinating to me. And we're still obviously playing that out in a lot of different areas. And a lot of these communities are essentially experiments in how do we strike that balance.
In terms of striking the balance between structure
and decentralization. Exactly.
Okay,
structure and sort of dynamism, right? How do we strike that balance? Yeah.
Well, that's a great point, because when I think about the crypto ecosystem, the coin, which has probably done the most for decentralization and probably is the best example of it, is the OG, right? It's Bitcoin, because it doesn't depend on. It doesn't even really depend on a roadmap, or it doesn't depend on any of the kinds of things that most communities or most projects have at their core. It doesn't depend on DAO governance or any of these kinds of things. So the shortcomings that come with more cooperative modes of governance don't negatively hinder it, but also the shortcomings of centralized modes of decision making also don't hinder it. So it's just like winning on both fronts. And I'm very attentive to how there is in the Web3 ecosystem, there are a lot of highly centralized components and players, and there's also some real authentic attempts at decentralization. And sometimes it can actually be hard to tell what they are, because, even in DAOs that are highly decentralized, you've got these whales of tokens that can basically just vote for whatever they want, and they got the tokens early. And then, you might have some more centralized entities. You might have, just startups, for example, but that are very attentive to what their community is asking for and responding to them and airdropping them things and stuff like that. So it's at the very least, I think it's a good sign that in Web3 we're able to have the discussion, and that you're able to have this kind of spectrum, and that you see the experimentation taking place. And I suppose we'll see what ends up being the most successful over the long run. But right now, I think the positive sign is that if you look at the two most influential and impactful projects, and also the two projects with the largest market cap, it's Bitcoin and Ethereum. And Bitcoin is extremely decentralized and Ethereum is highly decentralized. So it bodes well for the space.
Yeah, there's been a lot of work to try and develop measurements of decentralization. So we know that there's some work done out of University of Edinburgh, I think, to sort of create. We've got different measurements like Nakamoto coefficient, these different ways of trying to measure decentralization. So it'll be interesting how that plays out and how that actually weighs into decisions, from communities or for developers or investors rather to participate in these sort of ecosystems, right? How important is decentralization? Is important enough for you to make investment or build decisions based on that measurement of decentralization?
Yeah, that'll be great to follow. And I wasn't familiar with those metrics. So yeah, thanks for putting them on my plate.
Yeah. Look, I'm going to read something to you. I've started reading. I mentioned in a note that I sent to you earlier, Right Click Save, this book that I just got about a week ago, and it's a beautiful book. It's edited by Alex Estorek. I don't know if you know Alex, but it's a collection of interviews and essays really looking to sort of trace the history of digital art. So the subtitle of the book is The New Digital Art Community. So there's a point here that I want to read to you from one of the essays. And it's, I hope, a good segue into talking more specifically about art. So I put on my specs for this one.
Yeah, great.
The title of this essay is NFTs and the Revenge of Surrealism. And it's Isabella Wilkinson who's writing this. And the point I'm going to pull out here is not really so much about surrealism, but more about the broader impact that decentralization and Web3 has on artists. So I'll read here. Perhaps this idea resonates with contemporary artists at a time when traditional forms of acquisition have been destabilized by Web3 principles of decentralization and democratization. In its rejection of established modes of buying and selling art, NFT commerce has reincarnated artists and collectors as hybrid entrepreneurs within a new culture of co-creation. What do you make of that?
Mm-hmm. Well, by the way, the book looks really interesting, and I'm hopefully going to be able to read it one day. I'm looking forward to it. I've noticed that it's out there, and I've read a number of articles on Right Click Save. Really high quality publication, by the way. By the way, I wanted to ask you, to get this book, did you have to sign up for some kind of membership, or are you able to just buy the book on its own?
I did sign up for Right Click Save. I was interested in what they're doing. And as far as I understand it, Club NFT, and there is a relationship between these two different organizations. So Art Gnome from Club NFT and Right Click Save, there's some crossover there. What they're doing to sort of preserve the asset, the underlying NFT asset. As you know, some collectors are actually still holding those even in non-custodial wallets or on marketplaces, or where is that asset actually stored? Is it on IPFS, or where is it? So they're trying to create tools to provide collectors with mechanisms to retain sort of ownership and continuity of those assets. So I think I signed up for that, and then I had an option to buy the book. But there is, I think you can just buy the book, I believe. I've seen links to that. So I can put links in the show notes as well.
Yeah, share a link. If there's an option to just buy the book, I'd love that. When I did a brief search for it, it seemed to be prompting me to sign up for a membership to get the book.
Which is a very Web3 sort of approach to
exactly.
to asset distribution, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah.
It is. Although I'm intentionally limiting the amount of memberships that I'm on, because otherwise it can become unwieldy. But it looks like a great book. I'm eager to read it. In terms of my initial reaction to the quotation, I mean, you can pull out some things too that you think might be particularly relevant, and we can discuss more in detail. But I think first and foremost, what the author seems to be alluding to is that we're seeing a whole new cohort of art collectors thanks to Web3. And I think there's a number of reasons why that's the case. A lot of reasons why it's the case, actually. So on one hand, I'm just trying to organize what I think would be actually the best way to talk about why there's so many new collectors, because there's a lot of them. The first is I think a lot of people just feel like they are not a part of the traditional art world because there's these like imaginary barriers to entry that are there. They're slowly coming down, or maybe even quickly coming down, because I know especially the mega galleries like Hauser and Wirth and Pace and Gagosian, they do incredible marketing and they make all of their exhibitions free to the public. And so ironically, there's this situation where the commercial galleries, which are private enterprises, actually have free admission to all of their shows, but public museums actually charge, and sometimes charge like a pretty high ticket price, relatively speaking, compared to other forms of entertainment.
Right.
They actually have to charge to get in. So the public venue, you actually have to pay to get in. The private venue is free to enter.
Amazing.
Nevertheless, I think there is still some kind of mental barrier for a lot of people to just going into a private art gallery because of any number of reasons. Could be just some kind of social sense of social isolation from it, sense of not belonging. Can be intimidating, not knowing what's expected of one's behavior inside, not knowing if one's allowed to buy it, right? And there's so much opacity around how to purchase a work of art.
And there is some of that as well that's interesting. Like in some cases, you're not allowed to buy it. I'd like to get into that sort of some of those strange nuances of the art world.
Exactly. In most cases, if you're going to a top tier gallery, you're going to one of the mega galleries, in most cases, that's correct. You're not allowed to buy it because it's reserved for the gallery's top collectors who want to have early access to those works, and they've earned their early access by buying a bunch of other works and being a good patron of the gallery and having a good relationship with the gallerist. So when their hot new artist comes out with works on the primary market, which very likely when they enter the secondary market in however many years will be at a substantially higher price because these artists are associated with a mega gallery in New York, like Pace, like Gagosian. Everyone wants to buy them. Everyone who's got the money wants to buy them, right? So there's more buyers than sellers in that particular very select segment of the market, the high end of the mega galleries. And so in that kind of a setting, you can walk in and you can see the new exhibit, but unless you're on that collector list and you bought things there before and you have a great relationship with the gallery, or you're using an art advisor who has that kind of relationship, then your average person off the street, even if they have the money to buy it, isn't going to have the access, right? So that's just a matter of fact, okay? And that's the way things work. So you compare that
it's just it's a longer term sort of whitelisting process, but there is a whitelisting.
That's what I was going to say. It's the allow list, right? They're on the allow list. So but when you compare that to NFTs, it's true there are allow lists and there's a certain politics to that. You need to be in the know. But I think in general, that feels a lot more open to people who want to get involved in it than trying to build up some rapport with the gallery where you're buying physical artwork for years and this type of thing, right? So I think that's kind of the first barrier, is just there's very specific people who have access and most who don't. And Web3 opens that up in a lot of ways, especially with the emphasis more recently on different types of fair mints, different types of Dutch auctions, all these kinds of ways for people to, if they have the capital, they have the interest, to get involved. Also, so many NFT projects do all kinds of collaborations where they make sure other communities get access to whitelist spots, where they're offering these allow list spots for people who do some kind of co-marketing for them or people who kind of work for the project. So there's a lot of ways for people to get involved in Web3 and get access to the digital art that at least at the top end of the traditional art market, is very difficult. It would be unfair, though, to say that about the rest of the art market, because in fact, once you leave that top segment of the traditional art market, it's actually the inverse that's true. There's much more art than there are buyers. And so as an art collector, if you go into what would be called, I don't really like to use these terms because I feel like it's somewhat pejorative, like top tier, mid tier, low tier. But if you just go into what is generally called like a mid-tier gallery, so a gallery that isn't a mega gallery, doesn't mean that their art's any less quality. It doesn't mean that the artist has produced anything of lesser quality. Yeah. It just means in terms of the economics of it, it's they haven't been anointed, exactly. So but if you go into those kinds of venues, you can actually buy the art because there's a lot more art than there are buyers, and there's actually a shortage of collectors, especially once you get out of that top tier. So
do you see that pattern? I mean, one thing that I've been trying to understand, and I've spent a little bit of time trying to understand the traditional art world. I'm very, relatively new to that space and sort of the patterns there. And similarly to Web3, I guess all of us are relatively new to that because it's relatively new. One thing that I think I'm observing is a tendency for these patterns to reemerge in Web3, just as they've emerged in the traditional art world. Would you say that's a fair thing to say? I mean, there are mechanisms and tools in Web3 that allow for greater inclusiveness and allow for a more democratized access to the art and democratized ways to publish and distribute the art. But ultimately, what you've described as far as these sort of top tier, exclusive, access only the anointed can participate, is that occurring also in Web3?
Well, there are ways that barriers end up being erected. So for example, you can just look at what's taken place on Ethereum over the last few years. So that's been the major NFT hub. That's where the vast majority of the action has been. Everything else has effectively been quite secondary to that, right? Obviously, there's been some action on Tezos. There's been some stuff on Solana, Polygon. It's all minor compared to where the major collections are. And
real volumes.
That was up until basically the last year, Ethereum. And at first, that's super democratic, right? It's Ethereum. It's a permissionless, open source, decentralized blockchain. Anyone can just get their wallet, buy their ETH, and buy the NFT, right? And participate, get on OpenSea, right? OpenSea is not asking you for, your track record as an art collector, right? OpenSea just says, come on in, and whatever's there, you can buy it. That said, there starts to become ways where people start to feel priced out or the fees start to augment, right? Like now we're looking at a situation where people don't want to pay the fees on Ethereum anymore. And I think the price of Ethereum is probably going to keep going up over the next year. I think we're in a new bull run now, and who knows what the price could go up to, right? I don't really want to put a price prediction on it, but it could go up to over 10K potentially. Wouldn't surprise me,
right? This is not financial advice, people.
And it's not. I'm just, it's definitely not. I'm just kind of hypothesizing on where it could go, right? Yeah. My guess is if I had to take a directional bet, it's going up rather than going down over the next year.
Yeah.
So when that's the case, that means gas is going up. And people don't want to pay, and rightfully so, $100 on a transaction to pick up an NFT. And that's, even though that might seem like a small amount, when you're looking at art in the lower price tiers, that starts to actually be like a significant portion of the art. Like there's some NFTs by really high quality artists. Like I'm pretty sure, like for example, Trevor Paglen, he came out with an NFT series that he collaborated with Pace and their NFT wing called Pace Verso. And that's like available on OpenSea right now for, I don't know, like 0.0 something, right? Like it's like a few $100s, I think. And so you've got artworks that are by like good quality artists, and it's their first NFT project, and it might be trading for under $1,000. Then you're going to ask someone to pay 10%, 20, 30% in fees. That starts to become like the traditional art world's auction house market all over again. And then if there's some kind of creator fee, and then there's some kind of transaction fee potentially, it's kind of like, okay, why didn't I just buy something from Sotheby's where I pay the buyer's fee and it's 20%? Right. So in some ways, the fees start to reduplicate. The gatekeeping starts to reduplicate. It does happen.
Yeah. Do you see that driving more artists or collectors to other chains?
It's hard to see what's going to happen over the next year, but the major trend I've noticed over the last 6 months, and it's still in its nascent form, I would say, is NFTs on Bitcoin. It's Bitcoin ordinals. And so you've got ordinals. You've also got this new thing on Bitcoin, digital matter theory, and these UNATs, these, I believe they're called unique non-arbitrary tokens. So you've got this whole emergence of new types of tokens, new types of inscriptions.
What are UNATs for the audience? How would you describe those?
Yeah, I'm really not the best person to describe it because it's highly technical, but basically the idea is they're using the data on the Bitcoin blockchain to generate art. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Deriving the art algorithmically or otherwise from the existing ledger history, right? That data.
That's a more eloquent way to put it. Exactly. Yeah. So people can look more into it. Check out UNAT, check out DMT. I'm just seeing this come up in my feed and in conversations I'm having, and like, I don't have a technical background at all. So like I said, I'm not in the best position to explain it, but I'm seeing the novelty and I'm seeing the experimentation, and people who have that kind of background are getting excited about it. So that's when I start to pay attention. And it's super nascent. And up until now, no major artist has moved over and done anything on Bitcoin, right? So if you look at who the major artists were who've released collections in NFTs, I think the top performing artist, other than Snowfro, who made Chromie Swiggle, is Damien Hirst, right? He made the currency. So that's like a huge crossover artist in terms of someone who is like the biggest name or one of the biggest names in contemporary art. And this artist came over onto Ethereum, released an NFT collection, and it did really well. There's a few others, Takashi Murakami, right? He's come out with a couple of NFT collections. He had his flowers. Then there is the collective or the startup called Art World, and they brought a number of important artists over into Ethereum NFTs. Jill Majid, Paul Pfeiffer, who else did they bring over? Waleed Rad, a number of like important contemporary artists. The artists of the type who have reputable long form artist CVs with plenty of solo and group exhibitions in recognizable institutions that are collected by museums. People who are professional artists, right? Successful professional artists coming over and then doing NFTs, not this kind of like profile pictured, undoxed thing where people are coming out with generative iteration. So we saw that take place in the last cycle on Ethereum. And I just mentioned a small handful of artists. There's many more. We're
do you see that
continuing on Bitcoin? I think it will. I think we're going to see it in this new run. And I think that's what I'm excited to see is like which artists are going to keep coming out with more NFT collections, which artists are going to move over into Web3, and then also what chains are they going to choose? Like, for example, Ethereum kind of carved out the niche for itself, not even the niche, I would say like it carved out the role, like the really dominant role for itself as being the chain for contemporary artists to come release their NFT collection. And the other chains like Tezos was kind of more like amateur artists or like struggling professional artists, not people who had the biggest cachet, for example, with a few exceptions. Like Marina Abramovich did decide to release on Tezos at the time because that was before Ethereum switched to proof of stake, and she wanted a greener blockchain. It was an energy thing. It doesn't really apply anymore, but Marina Abramovich did go on Tezos, and her collection didn't sell out because it was on Tezos. So
I guess so. A question I have there is, Yeah, is ETH's dominance really just the fact that that's where the liquidity was, right? That's where the demand was. That's where the audiences were, so they could get the ticket prices they were going for. Whereas these other chains, these other L1s, didn't really have that financial capacity to really provide the artists with what they were looking for the works, right? And is that, it's not necessarily the best in terms of overall technical infrastructure. I think, and we can deep dive into that technically, what that means. It's not the best overall in terms of transaction fees. It's amongst the worst, probably the worst in terms of transaction fees. But if my ticket price is 10 or 100x what I could expect to have in Tezos, and if I could sell out a collection, if it's more likely that I'll sell out a collection, why would I not go to Ethereum, right?
Exactly. So it made sense for artists for that reason. It's where the liquidity is and was. It's where the action was, and at least a decent amount still is, even if Bitcoin has been getting a lot of traction with ordinals. So it still makes sense, I think, as the very logical place for artists to be releasing collections. That said, I do know that some contemporary artists are looking very seriously at coming over and releasing Bitcoin ordinals collections. So I know for a fact that within the next few months, you're going to see artists that released on Ethereum last year, for example, through the platform LiveArt, which is a major contemporary art NFT platform that was doing this kind of crossover for contemporary artists coming and releasing NFT collections. I know they announced they're going to be launching with one of their artists on Bitcoin. So you can keep your eyes peeled for that and start to see like these artists that came over, used Ethereum, launched on Ethereum, they're going to be attempting that on Bitcoin as well. We'll see how it works. We'll see if the Bitcoin community embraces that. I know there's already been a lot of pushback against ordinals, which still kind of has like the flavor of being a degen and being crypto native. So then when you have something that's like not even crypto native and they're just selling contemporary art on Bitcoin, but it's like inscribed on Bitcoin, we'll see how that resonates with people who are on Bitcoin, first of all. Second of all, we'll see if people who would normally collect these kind of artists want to go onto Bitcoin to buy it, because then, keep in mind, Bitcoin doesn't necessarily have a great reputation amongst people who are just in the art world. Like a lot of times people, they don't like Bitcoin. They associate it with all kinds of negative things they don't like. There's libertarianism, toxic masculinity, just waste of energy, all this kind of environmental concerns, right? And then of course there's a certain, I think a certain facet of it is people are also a bit, there's a certain contingent of the population which is just a bit resentful that they missed it as well, right? And they saw other people make money. So there's all these things. It's like, do people really want to start buying now? Do people who would normally collect like a print, for example, of a contemporary artist for like $5,000, do they now want to buy $5,000 worth of Bitcoin, which is like whatever it is, like 0.05 Bitcoin or something, right? So they're buying this like what looks like a really small amount of Bitcoin. They're buying some Satoshi's worth to then buy what's the equivalent of kind of like a print in the print market. Like are print buyers going to be buying Bitcoin to then go on to Magic Eden to then buy an NFT of an artist who they might normally purchase a print from, or a lower priced artwork? I'm not sure. We'll have to see if that kind of adoption happens or if it just comes natively from Bitcoin. But my guess is like the people who are doing things on Magic Eden right now, who are in the ordinals ecosystem, this kind of stuff that isn't blockchain native, I don't think is going to resonate with them.
But they're not the market for it, right?
But they're not the market for it. So who is the market for it? It's people who are maybe already buying this artist and they need to come onto Bitcoin, maybe from outside of Web3, or maybe they're being asked to come over from Ethereum and start doing things on Bitcoin too, which maybe that's not too far of a stretch.
That's a lower,
right? Like if someone's,
that's a lower barrier there, I'd say. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, do you spend much time speaking with or educating traditional art collectors or traditional art galleries on digital art, on Web3 art, on NFTs?
Actually, I just remembered, David, there was something else I wanted to say too in response to your previous question about choosing the chain. I think this is actually a really important point, where artists choose to go. And it's that the other reason I think people chose Ethereum is not just because of the liquidity or where the action was and where other artists were launching NFTs. That was clearly a big part of it, right? That's network adoption effects. But it also has to do with the base asset. And this is the way I think about it. And I think this is very important both for art collectors and for artists, which is that the chain that an artist chooses to launch their collection on, the chain that the artist chooses to put their art on, they're effectively investing in that chain. And they're effectively investing in the base asset of the chain. So for example, when you have these artists, like when Damien Hirst would sell the currency, when Murakami would sell his flowers collection, et cetera, et cetera. What are they getting in return when they sell the art? They're getting ETH, right?
Yeah.
Right. People send ETH to their contract address. So
but they could flip out of that pretty quickly if they wanted to, right?
They could. Yeah. But for example, if someone's offering to pay you in Tezos token, is that as convincing of a sell as right. It seems less attractive, right? Same, even if you just kind of go down a notch, and like I'm a huge supporter of Polygon and I like everything they're doing, and I like their token even, but like even just when you look at that, few artists I think want to sell their art for Matic token.
Right. It's about the quality of the financial side of that transaction and that underlying asset, right? That's interesting.
Same thing. Like if you go to Sotheby's and you're offering to pay them, they have a list of currencies they'll accept.
Yeah, you're not necessarily
and they won't accept certain. Exactly, they won't accept other ones, right? And so I think that's a big part of it for that reason, that like the artists want to get paid in a solid currency. Additionally, one thing we've seen too is that auction houses have started to accept. The premium auction houses like Sotheby's and Christie's have started to accept cryptocurrency payments, particularly for digital art. So like when Sotheby's does its natively digital sales and they're selling Bitcoin ordinals, or when they're selling a CryptoPunk or any of these like blue chip kind of NFT type artworks on Bitcoin, they'll accept the crypto for it. And so there's also been this convention that's been established, especially over the last few years, as these auction houses were doing sales of Ethereum-based NFTs, is that they were accepting ETH as payment. And so you'd even see on like the auction board, the artwork priced in ETH at these really prestigious auction houses. And I think psychologically, that's a huge hurdle that's been overcome just by the fact that exists. And one thing I noticed, and I started tweeting about this back in like 2021, is I tweeted out this hypothesis that ETH could become the money of art. And I'd probably temper that statement now to say maybe it would become the money of digital art, or like it did become the money of digital art, and it might hold on to that.
Or
and as digital art grows,
but
and as digital art grows to become a bigger part of the art ecosystem, which it is, then ETH as the money of the art world could kind of start to take foothold. It's not that far of a stretch, right? So that's another important point too, I think, to consider amongst all of this, is how even having these prestigious artworks and having these prestigious artists on the chain also benefit the asset. And that's kind of an investment thesis for people to even just buy the asset, even if they're not buying NFTs, because it's like, there's a certain prestige and allure around the asset. And it's kind of like, for example, in the art world, there's a big difference between an artist having a solo show in Manhattan and an artist having a solo show somewhere in Ohio.
Yeah.
And it's not because the arts is necessarily any different. It could be the same artworks by the same artist showing in different galleries. But the fact that it's on the island of Manhattan, and then of course
it's more expensive
well-known gallery, there's an allure and a prestige that it's in the center of the art market and you showed in Manhattan. That's the artist dream, right? And so when you transpose that kind of analogy of the art city onto the blockchains, I think that's a fair analogy to make. And I'm still thinking through like what that actually entails for the long run. But what I think's happened is that over the last couple of years, ETH effectively carved out its role as the Manhattan of art for digital art. And then Bitcoin has now it's sort of challenging it, or it's trying to challenge it, and maybe it's some alternative city. Maybe it's the Miami of art, where there's a lot of great art and great art transactions you can do there. And then, maybe Tezos is kind of like, I don't know, maybe it's like the Berlin of art, where there's less money there, but there's amazing art or something, right? So who knows? I don't want to like stick my neck out and like draw these comparisons because I have to put more thought into it, right? And I don't want anyone's art scene to feel offended by comparison to a chain, right? But it's just to kind of lay the conceptual landscape that you can think of these chains as kind of being like regions or cities with their own art scenes that develop prestige, develop certain artistic conventions, maybe even develop a style, develop expectations, which are all unique. And I think we're only going to continue to see that play out with an ever greater degree of pluralism, most likely across chains over this next bull run. Or who knows, maybe we'll get a consolidation into one chain and ETH will just like really emerge as like the one. But I think it's going to go in the pluralism way, because I see interesting art. I see generative art on Solana now. I see interesting stuff on Bitcoin. Then there's ETH, and then we'll see how these alt layer ones factor in as well. So that's something else I'm monitoring, which is how the chain factors into the choice of the artist and how the value system is reflexive.
That to me is interesting. And speaking of generative art in particular, the underlying sort of tech stack has implications for generative art in particular, or on-chain art especially, right? And so, I follow the Cardano ecosystem fairly closely, and there's some really incredible on-chain generative stuff that's being done in that space. And part of my understanding, and I'm not a developer or a coder, so I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on the technology here, but the native asset architecture of Cardano provides some really interesting advantages for on-chain art, right? In the sense that these aren't smart contracts; these can be natively on-chain, right, as an asset, and that's really interesting. And so, one of the artists that I follow, Charles Machen, doing some incredibly beautiful generative on-chain art. Like it's all, the code is in 16 kilobits, and it's basically creating this incredibly rich, diverse, pieces that are they're not nearly as expensive as a piece on ETH, but from what I've seen, they're just as beautiful and interesting, if not more in some ways. So how did the different architectures of these chains impact a creator's choice, but also impact the potential, for new innovative pieces?
Well, exactly. So I think that's the perfect follow-up question, which is that in addition to artists taking into account the scene of their chain, so to speak, and what else has been done there, and these economic considerations and investing in the base asset and all that kind of stuff and the liquidity. Additionally, there's also this fact that a lot of what's been most successful in the NFT space has been Web3 native, blockchain native types of projects that make use in some way of the blockchain to actually make blockchain art, rather than to just bring contemporary art into the metaverse or into Web3, tokenize it, and then you've got a token of contemporary art. That works, and we've seen that, but I think what's been the most successful, and probably what's almost guaranteed to continue to get traction, are projects that do artistic work which engages directly with the materiality of the chain that they're on, and also the historical significance of that chain. And this is kind of something I started to notice with these DMT projects I saw coming up, which is that they're building on the history of the Bitcoin blockchain and the history of the blocks that are there, and in a way that the generation of the art is completely enmeshed in the way the blockchain unfolded through time. And so the history of the artwork is inextricable from the history of the chain. And also the future of the artwork is inextricable from the future of the chain. Exactly. So that's what we're seeing, where I think the reason why there's so much traction coming on Bitcoin right now is that it's emerged as being like the most decentralized, the most robust, the asset with the most longevity, and probably the asset with the most secure future of everything in Web3, right? And so if you're thinking about from an artist's perspective, what chain might an artist want their art to be inscribed upon? I think it only makes sense that they might want it to be inscribed on the most robust chain with the most
the greatest
secure
chance
promise.
of immortality is perhaps Bitcoin.
Exactly. And so I think artists are realizing that, and then they're realizing, oh, wait, there's ways to use the data in the way this blockchain's unfolded through time to actually generate work too. And so my art can be informed by the history of the chain, and then it can be immortalized by the chain, and then I can kind of bet on the chain too, and also get paid in the currency of the chain. It's like all these things together. It's super. Exactly. And so I do think it's going to be something that continues to weigh on how artists make their decisions, which is precisely the perceived future of the chain. And I think artists are going to take that very seriously. And also what the infrastructure, the materiality, or, what
are the tools available?
The tools, the apparatus of the chain, so to speak, what that provides them. Whether it's just a token to plug in something else that they made in everyday life and make a token of it, okay? Or do they want to engage with everything that a blockchain actually is on the technological side? So we're seeing artists do that, and I think that's going to become more and more of a concern and something that is on their mind. And we'll see to what extent artists who don't have a background in Web3 want to engage in that realm. And we'll see also how the audiences and the collectors who are there on these chains, how they receive artists coming on who decide not to engage with that materiality. And maybe those projects won't do as well. Maybe there's a real demand for projects that are informed by the logic of the chain. And I think a consequence of this too, David, is like, I haven't thought through the consequences of this fully, but I do have the sense that this could actually change our perception of art history, because right now, the way art history is structured, the way art history is structured is that it's structured based on years and decades and centuries, and these periods are bracketed off from one another.
By the collectors.
And so there's a view of history which is based on the chronology of Western civilization and how it's been dated, okay? But now we're in this era where you can date blockchains not by like what happened on March 23rd, 2024, but what happened on block number whatever it is. And so I'm starting to see some conversations coming up on Twitter where people are dividing up periods of NFT history or even periods of activity in the ordinals ecosystem, not based on like year 2021, year 2022, year 2024, right? But based on block X to block Y, and we could end up entering into like some new, even like historical realm.
There's a new grammar
based,
of how we define art.
That's not like before death and after death, but that's before Bitcoin block whatever number and after Bitcoin block whatever number, right? Like it.
Yeah, you see that. So I've lived overseas quite a bit, and one of the things that you do is you have to start to adapt your thinking to the local currency, right? So rather than always sort of going back to USD, you start to sort of localize your thinking about currency. And I think what you're describing is this way of now, and we see that in cryptocurrencies where in some communities, like they speak in ETH or they speak in BTC when they're talking about a currency. And you're talking about that in a temporal sense, defining periods of art history against the block or against the epoch or whatever that particular chain has as a mechanism of keeping record. Yeah, interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's where it's going.
Yeah, that's cool. The thing that I was asking you earlier, we went down a rabbit hole, and I'm happy to continue going.
Thanks for letting me go down that, because as you can see, we had a lot to say about the chains.
There are infinite rabbit holes we could run down, but I'm really interested in how your conversations with traditional collectors and or traditional galleries, or potentially even traditional artists, like how are you explaining? Or maybe you're not. Maybe you're only, sort of dealing with people who see the light already, as it were. But are you having many conversations where you're trying to explain why Web3, why NFTs, and probably dealing with some of the baggage of NFTs post,
Yeah.
PFP hype? Um, how are those conversations going? What's the reluctance if you're seeing that, or what are the main sort of questions, fears that you're seeing from those sorts of folks?
Yeah, great question. So there's a lot I could say here. The main thing that I like to emphasize in conversations I'm having with collectors and also in my writing, and I just actually wrote an article about this that came out last week or earlier this week, actually, in Mutual Art Magazine, where I regularly publish my reports and thoughts and analysis of the art market. And I published an article about the most recent Art Basel UBS Art Market Report
Right,
2024 by Dr.
right.
Claire McAndrew. And this is the annual report that comes out by an art economist who's very respected. And it's a really great report. It gives you like all of the key figures you could possibly ever want as someone who's an art market professional or someone with an interest in the art market. It tells you everything about the annual turnover, sales data, broken down by region, category, you name it, right? It gives you everything you could possibly want. I was looking through this, and when writing my article summarizing some of the key takeaways from it and giving my analysis of it, it really occurred to me that there's really so little growth. There's actually no growth in the art market. And I know that might sound drastic or like I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. You can take a look at that art market report. You can take a look at my analysis of it, and you'll see that over the last 15 years, the turnover at auction houses of art has effectively been flat in
Correcting for
nominal
inflation,
terms.
right?
In nominal terms. So when you correct
Wow.
for
Oh,
inflation,
wow.
it's negative. And so, I don't want to give the author of the report too much flack because she does a lot for the industry, and it's a good report. And ultimately, I recommend everyone reads it and take stock of it because it's an important document. But that said, the choice to present these numbers in nominal terms rather than real terms is intentional. It's to try and make the art market look better than it is. Let's
Right.
just be frank about it. And so we're able to say, all right, like we're back to our highs from 2024 or whatever, or from 2014 or whatever it was, like a
Right.
decade ago.
Right.
And that sounds like all right. It's like, okay, we're kind of like near the highs, but like you actually just like zoom out, you look at the chart, you're like, there's no
Yeah.
growth in this whatsoever. And
Interesting.
then that's in nominal terms. And then you take into account the massive inflation we've seen since the
Yeah.
lockdowns and everything a few years ago. And it's negative growth. It's declining. So that's the state of the traditional art market. I would say, I wouldn't really say it's in crisis because it seems to just get along fine the way it is, but it's not growing.
Well, and it
And it's
grows in
this, yeah.
cycles as well, right? And we're sort of
Yeah.
in this inflationary period. So is that included? Maybe I'm jumping your article a bit here, but if we were to take digital art sales, which I'm assuming aren't included in the report, or maybe they are, but is that making up the delta?
So this is exactly where I was going with it, and it's in the report. And so, in the report, they talk about digital art. They have a brief section on NFTs. I think that section could be built out a lot more. There's a lot more that could be said there. I do get the impression when reading it that it is written by an outsider who's not really fluent in everything that's going on in NFTs. But that said, they do present the data, and so it's there, and that's important, and it is included in the report. And what you'll notice is that despite the huge pullback in NFTs over the last couple of years, it's still up like an order of magnitude or more from where it was in 2020 when it was in its infancy and there was like practically nothing, right? And the infrastructure wasn't there. There weren't popular marketplaces or anything. So if you're looking for growth, so, to answer the question that you originally asked, which was, what am I talking to people about? What am I writing about? What are the conversations I'm having? Is what I tell people is if you're frustrated with the lack of growth and the lack of opportunity in the traditional art market, take a look at Web3, because for, all of the potential issues that someone might have with it, and we can point to a handful of them. Nevertheless, it's where the growth is. So if you're looking for growth, if you're looking for opportunity, if you're a young collector, if you're looking for some excitement in the art market, if you're looking for something that can actually go up and go up quickly, it's somewhere to play around.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And is that I've got a bunch of things to ask you about that, but what is the reaction to that? If you're sharing that sort of conversation, have you had any reaction to the piece yet, or to these recommendations that you're making for young collectors or established collectors? Are they resistant to it? Are they still jaded by cryptocurrency and NFT and the hype and the rugs and all the stuff that makes people concerned?
Yeah, so I did an interview recently with a luxury and an art newsletter called The Affluent CEO, and in it we were talking about the benefits and drawbacks of Web3 art collecting and how it is different from what's there in the traditional art market. And when I posted on my LinkedIn, I did get a couple of comments saying like, "Hey, I'm never going into Web3s, has such a bad reputation, don't believe in it." And so I think there is a lot of reticence still, especially amongst traditional art collectors. And fair enough, I'm not the type of person who says everyone needs to adopt it or that it needs to be the standard for everyone. I think it's not for everyone, and that's completely fine. But if someone's looking for something that they can't find in the traditional art market, they're looking for a degree of accessibility that maybe isn't there. They're looking for a different mode of collecting as well. The art market report by Clara McAndrew, she also mentions this in the report, which is that I think the average holding period for like a physical work of art is like over 10 years or something like that. And the average holding period for an NFT, I think, is about 30 days, I believe is what I said in the report. I'd have to check the exact number, but they crunched the numbers on it, and they found that it was about...
They don't segment out PFPs and sort of one-of-ones, though, do they? Yeah.
No, it didn't go into that detail. They had some kind of vague categorization in there about the differences between collectibles and art, and I'm not even sure how they drew the distinction. I don't know what an NFT collectible is versus what NFT art is according to their categories, and that was never explained in the report. But effectively, the main takeaway there is that there's a flipping culture, right? And there's a shorter holding period, and I would never, as an art advisor, recommend someone just collect something for 30 days because that's not really collecting. That's complete speculating, and that's flipping, right? But if you're looking for opportunity, if you're looking for some excitement, if you're looking for a different modus operandi, if you're looking for a different cultural approach to art collecting and trading and swapping and participation and investment, it's interesting, right? Because you can sell it. Like just to even put this more bluntly, like in the traditional art market, if you go and buy something from a gallerist, they're going to tacitly assume that you're not going to turn around and sell it. And if you do, quickly sell that artwork that you just bought from that gallerist you just developed a nice relationship with, it's very likely that you as a collector will be blacklisted from the gallerist. And the next time you call to buy another artwork, they'll say no thanks. And it's because they need to manage the careers of their artists, and they don't want the secondary market of their artists becoming oversaturated with works that could dampen their price trajectory, which is being very...
And they want to manage where that work lands, right? Which gallery is it going to be shown to? Which collector is it in? Back to that whole prestige exclusivity conversation.
It's partially that too. It's partially that. It's more they just want to control the price, and they also want to control, also where it appears. And when things start to appear on auction, it just opens up a whole new universe that some artists aren't ready to enter into, and it can damage them. It opens them up to...
It signals that there's more supply, right? And in traditional economics now, what does that do to price in general, right?
Exactly. And it also, it pulls the veil back a little bit, because the thing about auctions are they publish the price, they publish what it sells for, and you can watch the auction. They're all posted on YouTube, and they all do live streams. and you can watch it and you can see precisely like how many people bid on it, what the bidding was like, what the energy was like in the room, and how much it sold for, and what the estimate was. It's in the catalog. So all that information's out there. Whereas an artist who's pre-auction and doesn't have a secondary market and doesn't have a track record of auction sales, there's a mystery around what the price is. No one quite knows if it's And so when that gallerist, even if they've sold a lot of their artworks, if they have someone new coming who wants to buy for their second or third or fifth show or whatever, and there's no secondary market, they're able to have flexibility in their pricing and maybe even command a higher price and just manage the artist's career and manage their pricing levels, right? And the gallerist is able to do that. But once there's this public information out there, and anyone who just Googles the artist name is seeing auction results come up and seeing, oh, this thing sold for 10 grand, then they might wonder, like, why is the gallerist selling it for more? Or can the gallerist sell it for more than that, right? It really limits the gallerist's optionality. So all that is to say that in the traditional art market, for better or for worse, that's the way things function. And in the NFT world, no one is going to blacklist you for flipping your NFT. Like if you get in early on something that then starts getting a lot of hype, that other people start to recognize as potentially having artistic value, etc. If you're anticipating a trend in art, and maybe you buy a few and you want to keep a couple for your collection and you want to sell one because it went up in price, and you're getting real-time price information, something else that doesn't really exist in the traditional art market, because you can just log on to your marketplace. You can see exactly what they're trading for. And you say, hey, I want to take profits on this so I can buy more art somewhere else, and kind of move along quickly and have this kind of velocity of art collecting, a velocity of art investment that might not exist otherwise. I don't think we should be shaming people for wanting to exhibit that kind of market behavior, because ultimately they probably end up reinvesting the work in just other art, and it just gets other people in on the market. So I don't have a problem with people flipping works. And I think that's part of the excitement of the Web3 space, is it allows people to do that. And you just can't do it in very few exceptions. There are exceptions, but in general, you can't do it in traditional art. And so say to someone who's 20 years old, who has an interest and a passion in art, that if you buy something tomorrow from a gallery, you're going to have to hold it for 10 years. It's like the person might not even know, like they might live in like 50 different apartments in the next 10 years. They might, you know,
and they've got to move the thing, right? Exactly.
And you're going to tell someone who's like, you know, living internationally and flying between places and backpacking or traveling or moving in and out of apartments. Like you're going to tell someone like that, you need to hold your artwork for 10 years.
Yeah.
Right. It's an old person's game, right?
Yeah. That's interesting. Well, that brings me back to sort of the what I read out of the book, and that quote around the co-entrepreneur type relationship that a collector and an artist can have in Web3. And there's a lot of different things occurring there. Obviously, the direct relationship, not being brokered through an agent or a gallery, the direct relationship that an artist can have with the collector through their wallet. I mean, they know where their piece is by virtue of the wallet and the transparency of the blockchain. So I can sort of communicate directly with you, even if you're anonymous. But then the other element of that is what other mechanisms can an artist utilize to encourage holding, for example, right? So I could actually measure, if you hold more than this amount of time, I can reward you with X, or I can reward you with, and that X may be additional pieces of work, or a whitelisting, or an exclusive, interview, or have lunch with me, whatever that is. We've got those mechanisms that are built into the NFT structure. So that's what are you seeing in that area of co-collaborative, the difference in the relationship between a traditional artist and the collector, and what occurs in Web3?
Yeah, it's a super important point. Thanks for bringing it up. And that's precisely what Damien Hirst did, for example, with the currency. Is he started then airdropping his next NFT collections to the people who held the currency. And so, sure, someone who realized a profit on that could have just flipped it to realize that profit. But then they would have missed out on the airdrop if they didn't have their NFT in their wallet anymore, because they sold it. So this also factors in that artists and whoever represents them, if there's some kind of gallery representing them on the blockchain, and we can also talk about the importance of maybe galleries in Web3 as well as another point of discussion. But But whoever is running that campaign for the artist is able to actually track the loyalty of the people who collect that artwork in very precise ways, in the ways like in
Yeah.
traditional art you can't. Your gallerist isn't going to come into your house per se and ask if it's still there, like inspect your collection, right? But because of the transparency of the blockchain, you can see exactly which wallets are holding a given NFT at any given time and how long they've held it for, just like you said. So in some ways, paradoxically, despite the culture of flipping that has developed on marketplaces like Blur, for example, in spite of that, you could say there are built-in incentive mechanisms for people to potentially hold these NFTs on the hope that they may be rewarded by the artist at some point in the future, or that they may even just be targeted by other projects who look up to people who hold that work. Like the thing too that would happen with a lot of blue chip NFT holders is they would then just start getting airdrop stuff from other projects because they're like, we want our project in the wallets of people who hold this really important NFT. And so imagine if you could just like send a flyer or like send a print or something to like everyone who owns a certain contemporary artist, and you just like have their mailing address and you could just like send them something to invite them to a show or get them interested in a younger artist or send them some kind of collectible. You can basically do that in Web3. So I think that's a huge game changer. And I mean, the advantages over doing things in the physical world are just innumerable. So I think that's a realm where we're probably going to continue to see artists reward their holders. And as for what kind of relationship that can create between the collector and the artist, I mean, I'm excited to see. I'm not sure exactly how that plays out, but I can't see it hurting the relationship. If anything, it would probably bring collectors and artists closer, especially when you're dealing with artists who are having success and selling out their collections, but they're not, superstar artists. Maybe they're becoming well known in their ecosystem or on their chain or in that niche that they've carved out for themselves in the space. So I think there's a huge runway there for potential.
So
yeah.
I was just going to ask about galleries in Web3, that disintermediation. That disintermediation between the, where we used to have a middleman, which was the gallery or the curator or the agent or whatever it is. How is that evolving? And I guess what's the role then? Because many artists that I've spoken to, they don't necessarily have that same commercial drive or even that commercial savviness that they understand that they need in order to be successful, right? So is there a role outside of that direct relationship, and what does that look like?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm glad you're bringing this up, and there's a lot I could say here as well. On the one hand, I think part of the excitement for artists in Web3 is precisely this fantasy of potentially making it big without having a gallery, right? That's kind of like, that's the pipe dream of every artist, to kind of wake up one day and find out you got 1 million likes on Twitter and you went viral and everyone loves your art and wants to buy your NFTs for millions of dollars worth of ETH, right? Because it's happened. Like that's what happened to people. I mean, he built that up over a long period of time, an online following, but he did that completely outside of the traditional gallery system. He didn't have an artist CV per se, where he's like getting collected by museums and playing that whole game. He was online first, digital first, and independent. So that's the dream for artists, right? Is that you can be completely independent and put your work out there and get discovered and make a name for yourself. And so that's great. And I'm a huge proponent of artists doing that. It can't hurt, right? That said, from an art historical perspective and from a curatorial perspective, it does lead to I wouldn't even say it leads to some issues. It just, curators and art historians need to just be cognizant that segment of Web3, which does exist, and that excitement is not representative of everything that's going on in the space. Because at the end of the day, that tendency, it's an amateur tendency, right? It's not a professional tendency. It's amateur artists trying to get discovered, trying to make some money off of their art. Sometimes that art can be great. Sometimes they can get discovered. Most of the time, it ends up just looking like a mess. Not because even what they're doing is necessarily that bad, although there is a lot of low quality stuff out there, but also just because it gets presented in completely uncurated ways.
Yeah.
And
How do you cut through the
yeah,
noise, right? You've got to
yeah,
make sure that your packaging and presentation is up to par because it's competitive.
exactly. And even just how is an artist supposed to present this if they're not associated with a gallery? So, for example, you have artists posting things on Twitter. Well, I can go on X and I go on there every day and I see people posting images and like I might think, oh, sure, that's an interesting image or that's well composed, but it doesn't mean anything because it's not curated. There's no artist statement around it. There's no curatorial context, and it's presented in a way that art wasn't really meant to be viewed. Like X is not an art viewing platform. It was originally a text-based platform for tweeting ideas and thoughts and opinions, and it's developed into kind of like a political commentary or public sphere type of platform. Then I know Elon's been pushing people to try and put more video content, image content, and people do that. And who knows, that could maybe be the next phase of X, that it's more audiovisual. Wouldn't surprise me, right? We're in an audiovisual age rather than textual. But still, it's not an art gallery, right? Like X is not an art gallery. And if someone even views a work of art on their feed, it's probably in between a bunch of other stuff. Like it could be someone like talking about a war and someone else talking about a politician. And then there's just like some random image in between, or like someone chatting about some topic and then some art thrown in there. That's not a proper presentation venue for art, to say the least, right? So with that in mind, it leaves a lot to be desired on the curatorial front when interacting with Web3 art. And additionally, I would say the marketplaces also feed in to this issue of a lack of curation, because when you go onto one of the main NFT marketplaces, if you go on OpenSea, for example, it looks like a mess. Like in all honesty,
how do you find anything?
Exactly. And there's just no sense on that website. And it's kind of become the model for what other NFT marketplaces tend to do. There's no sense of dividing things based on curatorial categories. Like, for example, if you go into a museum, there's different sections for different types of art. Seems kind of obvious, right? But you've got contemporary art, and it's not in the same section as the Renaissance art. You don't put the Renaissance painting right next to the contemporary, unless that's a very deliberate type of decision that an avant-garde curator made.
Juxtaposition is being forced.
But then you go on OpenSea and you've got some kind of, maybe you've got like the Tyler Hobbs Fidenza. Okay, those are great, love it. But then it's like next to some picture of some animal, next to something else that's like a ripoff of that other thing. It's like, okay, so there's no curatorial through line here. They're just throwing forward like things to buy in like this really ad hoc manner. And they're even organizing things based on like price rankings or based on volume rankings rather than curation, right? Which is understandable. They are a marketplace, so I'll give them like a bit of a free pass on this. But if people are looking to actually engage with digital art in a way that I think is actually most fruitful and most compatible with what art actually is, it would be a real pity if people were engaging with digital art for the first time on a marketplace and thinking that's like how it's supposed to be presented or what it is, because it's not, and it's a total mess. It's a jungle of cartoons on there. And, you've got then something like Takashi Murakami or Damien Hirst or Trevor Paglen or something just like mixed in with some like cartoon spin-off thing. It's like, it doesn't go together. It's like sifting for fine art in a dollar store, right? You don't, it's
that's
not
exactly
how
right.
art's for,
That's exactly why Aaron Arfman has started building the Curate platform. It's called curate.io, CUR8.io. And that's exactly the observation that he made, a year or so ago, that this is a mess. How do we cut through the noise? How do we do discovery properly? And then how do we do presentation properly? How do we actually make sure that we're housing and framing these works of art, which they are, in an appropriate way? And that requires an enormous effort in categorization. It requires enormous effort in terms of literally, in a digital sense, curating and hanging these pieces and framing these pieces in the most compelling way and providing artists or curators with those tools.
Exactly. And so that was my roundabout way of coming to your question about the galleries, because that's why. So to to come back to that, there's this enthusiasm in Web3 and this fantasy of like making it without a gallery. But based on everything I just said and the mess we see on these marketplaces and on X, for example, I think there's actually a real need for a gallery or a gallery type or gallery-like institution or function even in the Web3 space. Because what galleries do is they curate. They're curatorial entities. And a gallerist is a curator, right? This is a person who decides very thoughtfully which artists to have on their roster. They don't accept, if you go on any gallery's website, they do not accept unsolicited submissions, right? So they don't want artists throwing art at them saying, hey, represent me. They're highly selective about who they represent. They have a very thought out, nuanced curatorial through line that might be based on theme, ethos, identity, nationality, you name it. It's very well thought and planned out. And that leads to very well curated exhibitions, right? Which is why people go to see art in these spaces. And so in Web3, there are a number of analogs to the gallery. Probably the most prominent one is Art Blocks, which has been highly successful. And they've done an excellent job curating some kind of online analog, Web3 analog of the art gallery, specifically in the digital art, generative art, segment. So they've carved out that space for themselves. You've had other initiatives trying to do something similar to being a Web3 based art gallery. There's Art World, there's Feral File, there's Live Art. There's been a few handfuls of them. And I'm following them closely because to me, that's actually how I organize. There's also Pace Verso, their NFT wing. So that's what I'm following actually in the space is the galleries more than any individual artist, because at the end of the day, I think the galleries that do well, all the artists on their roster, those works will be lifted, and being a part of, for example, an Art Blocks collection really means something and creates a very strong distinction between things that are and things that aren't. And something that's part of that collection, as a collector, that it's of a certain quality, it's of a certain merit, it was vetted, experts in the field looked at it and approved it and found some value in it, versus if you go on OpenSea and you just stumble across something, there's no way to know what the value of that is. It's a flea market. And so, as an academic, I like to draw the distinction also between, like academic works that are peer reviewed versus works that are not. And, the gallery, the online Web3 version of the galleries are kind of like the version of the peer reviewed works where they've been vetted by peers.
Yeah, that's the service they provide, right? Is that curation, that filter that allows you to actually make your life a little bit more simple and not have to go through the flea market of digital art. Let me ask about real world venues then. And you mentioned a number of galleries that obviously there's online digital curators and galleries like Art Blocks that you've mentioned in the community that they've built around generative. But what's your experience with real world digital galleries? We've got a relationship with Tech Contemporary in Copenhagen. And there's a number of other real world digital galleries popping up. And in addition, I think, to that curation service that a gallery provides or a curator provides, you've also got that ability to go and meet people and talk to people and see these pieces that are displayed in the best possible way on the best possible hardware, so that your experience of them is what the artist wanted it to be, probably when they were conceptualizing these pieces, rather than just a thumbnail on your desktop or on your phone. So tell us about what you're seeing in the digital gallery, physical, real world gallery space.
Yeah, great question. To be honest, I wish I could say more about this, but I haven't been able to travel as much the last few months as I would like to see all of these different venues. But I'm going to be relocating to Europe later this year, at which point in time I think I'll be able to encounter a lot more of them. But I have noticed, for example, that Centre Pompidou acquired a number of NFTs into its permanent collection and did do an NFT exhibit. I didn't get the chance to see it in person because I wasn't in Paris at the time, but for me, I would probably look to them for anyone doing research in this area as to, what this looks like and how it
Mm.
appears when NFTs actually enter the gallery or enter the museum. I would probably look to them as being a good starting point for how these things should be displayed, what the quality was.
Mm.
Like I said, I wasn't able to see it myself, so I'm not sure if they really pulled it off or what the standard was that they set, but I would
Yeah.
imagine that whatever Centre Pompidou did was probably the gold standard, at least for that period of time from a year or two ago, and most likely would be able to be surpassed by people who are willing to push the envelope there, gallerists, curators at museums who are really willing to invest in the technology, the display, and also just think about things outside of like literally the box, right? Because most of these NFTs get presented as like squares, and
Yeah.
that's kind of like taking the computer screen as a predefined format. But as we know,
Right.
contemporary art throughout the 20th century explicitly made a point of spreading out past the canvas and even
Yes.
deforming the canvas. Like
Yeah.
we had numerous artists throughout the 20th century sometimes, take the frame off their art, like the Brazilian artist Lygia Clark. She would make unframed artworks specifically to gesture beyond the frame. You would
Yeah.
have other artists like slash the canvas, for example, or paint past
Yeah.
the canvas. So you had all kinds of gestures throughout 20th century art to move past the canvas, and
Yeah.
so I think Web3 artists are definitely going to want to move past the
Yeah.
square. I know some of them already are, and
Definitely.
then that becomes the curatorial challenge, right? Like, how do you
How do you be
then
creative and
create?
create interesting experiences? Yeah. One of the
How do you
things we
present it?
did with Yeah, one of the things we did
Yeah.
with Tech Contemporary on an AnyWall 98-inch beautiful LCD is we actually extended the physical gallery with a 3D environment, which had pieces of digital art up on the wall in this 3D environment. And then you were essentially felt like you were moving through this 3D environment. So we were extending the physical space beyond. And some of the other things, of course, that you can do with AR and VR and some of these immersive experiences are going to be pretty exciting to see over the next coming years.
Exactly, and that's what I'm really following, and what I think appeals to me most, and what I'm looking for in how artists engage with NFTs is
Mm.
I'm looking for artists who really engage with NFTs as a new medium. And just as I was alluding to, some artists who would like slash the canvas throughout the 20th century. The famous artist who did that was Lucio Fontana, who would literally slash the canvas and break it apart. I'm
Right.
looking for who's the artist going to be of
Yeah.
the 21st century who kind of slashes apart the NFT somehow, or breaks it apart,
Cool.
or breaks it open. And that's an artistic gesture that we see percolating at times.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of there also in some of these new things we're seeing on Bitcoin, like DMT, some of these
Mm.
inscriptions. It's a desire to move past the frame because the blockchain is decentralized, it's diffuse. And so when you're inscribing on the blockchain, it kind of raises this question as to where is it? It's not in my computer.
Yeah.
It's not on my screen. It's not in the museum or the gallery. Where is it? It's on the blockchain. Well,
What's that mean? It's
what's that,
ethereal.
right?
Yeah,
But
exactly.
it's inscribed. But nevertheless, it's materially inscribed on the blockchain. So
Mm.
that to me is kind of like
Mm.
the productive tension that I'm seeing as
Cool.
an analog to what I think artists were doing when contemporary art was experimenting in similar kinds of means with the canvas. That I think is going to be what takes the step forward, and what could actually be like a quantum leap forward in how we think of NFTs beyond the box and beyond the square. And then, of course, that raises a number of really exciting curatorial questions as well. So I'm excited to see where all of that leads. And in many ways, the artists are going to be the ones who drive this forward, right? Like, we can't predict it. That's why in some ways this sounds a little vague, because I'm not an artist who's experimenting with that, right? So I
Yeah.
don't have the solution. But when you see it, I have the sense when I see this, I'll be able to identify it.
Yeah.
And these are artists that I'm going to be championing, following, and hopefully collecting as well.
Yeah. It's the wow moment, right? When something makes you go, wow. That's
Yeah.
when you know. Yeah. Which artists are you following? Who's exciting for you? What's coming down the pipeline that you're keeping your eye on in terms of new collections or new emerging
Mm-hmm.
artists?
Yeah, good question. Well, maybe one thing that I noticed that came up recently was, let me just pull it up here. Yeah, one initiative that I'm keeping my eye on Solana actually is called Code Canvas, codecanvas.art. And it looks to me like they're trying to rival art blocks, but on
Hmm.
Solana.
Hmm.
And they've had a lot of success with, I think, both their minting pass that they have and with their first 6 collections that they've come out with, 7 collections that they have now. So I think those are going really well, and I'm keeping an eye on how they do, because I do think there's potential there for them to become an art blocks of Solana, for
Hmm.
example, and maybe even spin out into being something else. And I do think there's a demand for that, because as more and more people just become priced out of Ethereum, it only makes sense that more people will be on Solana. And I do think there will be an appetite amongst more educated, sophisticated, art-oriented people on Solana who aren't just interested in chasing meme coins or something that this type of project would appeal to. So that's the sort of thing I'm keeping my eyes on. I'm also keeping my eyes on what's happening in the ordinals space and what contemporary artists decide to deploy there. And I'll be monitoring whether or not they have success and how those are received by the community. And the other main trend I'm watching, which is less like an individual artist or gallery or anything, but it's more blockchain specific, is precisely how these various Ethereum L2s gain NFT traction, if at all. And I think this is actually going to be like a pretty defining moment for Ethereum NFTs this bull run, because last bull run it monopolized the NFTs. It was the clear king. And as we discussed, like it really cemented its role. But now that's become a bit shakier, and Ethereum has this, it's not a new roadmap, but it's like executed on its roadmap to become more layer 2 focused and to scale through layer 2s, right? We just had the new EIP 4844, which reduced the gas fees on L2. So these L2s now, they're super easy to use, they're super cheap, and they're all seamlessly functional with
Yeah.
Ethereum. But the issue there is they're all fragmented, right? And there's so many of them, and there's so many good ones,
Yeah.
right? Like there's Base, that's great. Like it's backed by Coinbase. Like who could bet against that? There's Arbitrum. It's got like ton of liquidity. There's Optimism. It's like it's like one of the, I think it might have been one of the first L2s. There's now Starkware that's out there, Starknet. And so there's so many of these L2s. And what it does is it kind of fragments the market, because if you're
Yeah.
launching an NFT project and you don't want to launch on Ethereum because of everything we know about Ethereum with the fees and whatnot, so you think, okay, I want to go L2, but then which one do you choose? Do you go with
Yeah.
Polygon, et cetera? And so the interesting thing about these L2s is they mostly use ETH as the gas on the L2. So you can
Yeah.
still trade ETH on the L2. So you can still get the ETH for your art. So I think that kind of works. But
Yeah.
then if you have NFT collections fragmented across all these different L2s, and that's the issue, right? Is I don't see many NFT collections on these L2s at all. They're all still stuck on ETH. And so it seems to me like there's a real opportunity for Solana, for Bitcoin to take a lot of momentum and take a lot of market share, unless one of these L2s on ETH is really able to position itself as like the NFT trader friendly L2. And it wouldn't surprise me if it happens, actually, because I know Blur, the marketplace, they have their Blast L2, which they came out with, which I believe is actually going to be trying to solve specifically for this. So it's going to be like an NFT L2.
Right.
And
Right.
maybe they'll solve this where they're able to just get important NFT collections on there. People will start to bridge their NFTs over to Blast and then trade them on there. So maybe that's going to be one of the big narratives of the coming year, is if this Blast L2 is able to get traction as an NFT chain and build off of Ethereum's winning legacy as the NFT blockchain. But we'll see. I'm following those 3 ecosystems closely. I think the majority of the action is going to be taking place across those 3.
Mhm.
And yeah, and then I'm looking at all of these various art collectives and gallery type entities, following who's on the rosters, seeing what they're coming out with, and watching how they perform as well and what chains they're on, and just enjoying the ride.
Awesome. So you're heading to Europe later this year. Are you going to be traveling at all? I'm heading to Dubai in a few weeks. Token 2049 is there, and ArtsDAO is there,
Yeah.
and so that'll be an interesting. Are you doing any events over the coming months?
No, I'm not personally going to be doing any through Omni. We're going to have some people there at Token 2049. So if you want to meet Tyler when you're
Oh, okay.
down,
Yeah, great.
talking about, he'll be there. We're also going to be at NFT NYC. But
Okay,
I'm just doing stuff from the home office, staying in the metaverse, staying on calls, just kind of doing
awesome.
things from here, trying to travel as little as possible. The last few years, like up until last year, I lived in like 25 different apartments over the span of 4 years
Wow.
or something like that, doing different postdocs, bouncing between places. And so I've really enjoyed just staying put in Toronto for a while,
Yeah,
and
nice.
being laser focused here. I also teach some courses in the film and media production department at Humber College on Fridays. So
Right.
I
Okay.
can't go too far away for too long because I am doing some in-person teaching this semester, which
Mhm.
will wrap up at the end of April. So with all that going on, I'm just grinding it out here, working on my
Nice.
computer, enjoying the ride, following everything going on in the space, advising
Great.
people, having these kinds of conversations, and following the art.
So where can people find you? I'll leave your contacts in the show notes here.
Yeah, that would be great. I'm active on all social platforms effectively, so you can find me on X. I'll drop my handle to David, so feel free to share it, David. I'm also on LinkedIn. That's where I'm most active these days with posting my long form art market articles. I find those do well with a lot of art collectors on LinkedIn. Twitter seems to have a bit less of patience for long form
Yeah.
stuff or linking to longer articles. So
Yeah.
LinkedIn is where I'm super active. I'm also on Instagram. If anyone wants to shoot me a DM, follow a lot of artists on there. It's a great place to to discover art, actually, physical art especially. So between those three platforms, I'm around.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Adam. Great
Yeah.
talking to you again. And of course, we could keep going for hours, I'm sure. And hopefully, we'll do this again soon.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Feel free to set something like this up anytime. And, with keeping our tabs on how the market develops, I'm sure the moment will be ripe for another conversation soon because the change happens so quick. You see collections fall and rocket. You see huge trend shifts and huge changes take place right before our eyes. So, yeah, we'll have to do this again soon and recalibrate how everything's looking,
Yeah.
which change are getting the market share, what the trends are. Absolutely.
Perfect.
All right,
Thanks,
Dave. Well,
mate.
it's a
Talk to
real
you soon.
pleasure, man. Thanks for the conversation.
Bye
Yeah,
bye.
chat soon.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye bye.